I think it's recording. So, but
Okay.
let's move on. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, let's go. Okay, so today, Professor Pellitteri, he will give a presentation about Japanese animation in Europe, a historical and sociological overview. Before we begin the session, let me introduce, Professor Pellitteri. He's an associate professor of media and communication in the School of Social Science and Humanities of Xianjiaotong Liverpool University. Among his publications, The Dragon and the Dazzle, okay, and Majinga Nostalgia. I hope you all know what that is. And I manga, Introducio al fumetto. Okay, this is Italian. I cannot pronounce it properly. Okay, and then he's the editor of Japanese animation in Asia, transnational industry, audience, and then success. He has published so many publications, and one of them, good journals he published. This one is like International Journal of Comic Art and Critica Cultura and Macadamia. So he published a lot of articles. He holds a PhD in sociology and social research from University of Trento. Now, Professor Marco Pellitteri, the floor is yours.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Everything is working fine. Thank you so much, Jimin, for the kind invitation and for the presentation. And thank you to you in the audience, everybody who is here. So I hope I will not disappoint you. Okay, so when I received this invitation from Jimin, so he asked me, hey, can you do a talk on Japanese animation in Europe? And clearly, since I have been studying the phenomenon of Japanese animation and Japanese popular culture in various facets in Europe for a few years, of course, I was very, very delighted to talk to an Asian audience about this, so to exchange very different perspectives on this, but also with the hope that we can also see maybe some similarities in the experiences. So a very, a foreign cultural object that is not, as a dominant in other contexts like other, foreign cultural objects becomes an element of distinction, but also of union among different audiences in different countries. So let's see if I can turn. So before I get into the topic, I want to quickly show you what I've been doing in the latest years. So this is the book. It is the fourth edition of a book that I originally published in 1999, which explored and investigated the social history of Japanese animation in Italy in particular. But in the fourth edition, in 2 volumes, from 2018, I have expanded the perspective to a more, global approach. But it is in Italian, but excerpts and parts of this book have been published or will be published here and there in English. And another book that I published in 2008 in Italian and in 2010 in English is The Dragon and the Dazzle that Professor Park has mentioned. And I think this you can find on Academia, if you want to download it. It's perfectly normal and legal. And it offers a European perspective on the notion, on the topic of how various cultural models, commercial strategies, and cultural identities of Japanese animation and Japanese imagination more in general have reached this very small continent called Europe. And in 2021, with my good friend and colleague, Professor Henhua Wong, we have published for Routledge this book that I think relates and resonates with you more deeply, I suppose, because Japanese animation in Asia also contains a beautiful chapter by MD Suraya Nasir, who is a Malaysian scholar, on the way Japanese animation has arrived in Malaysia, and how Malaysian animation studios have, in a way, embraced certain features of Japanese animation to create a new model, a new global model of animation that is at the same time inspired a bit, but also very authentic and original. And then there's also chapters on the Indian case, on Indonesia, South Korea, and so six, and the Philippines, six case studies on six major markets for Japanese animation in Asia. So let's move to the topic. Japanese animated cartoons, or anime from the English animation. For those among you who are already into animation made or designed or created in Japan, you know that the word anime has become, the umbrella word to define animation in Japan in general. However, let's clarify that anime is a huge subset of what's the meaning of Japanese animation. So animation created by Japanese animators, creators, authors, with Japanese or mainly Japanese capitals, in a situation of production that is mainly located in Japan, or at least in a situation of designing the animation that is mainly located in Japanese studios, whether in Tokyo or Kyoto mainly, and that is mainly addressed to a Japanese audience, and that is produced in a Japanese cultural milieu. Whether this production is multi-sited, meaning Toei Animation, for example, has since 1992 a huge studio, a huge branch in Manila, in the Philippines, or other parts of the production are outsourced here and there, that doesn't make this animation less Japanese. And there is a huge debate on the extension of the word anime to other forms or traditions of animation that maybe take something from the animations made in Japan and call that animation anime for marketing purposes. So that can be a very fertile debate, and if you want, we can talk about that later, because the phenomenon also applies to certain European-made animations. So in this talk, I will share with you a few things on the European context, but a first important clarification has to be made. I couldn't, or maybe a little bit, I didn't want to disperse my talk over so many European countries. Each European country has its own history and experience with Japanese animation. Europe is made, as you know, of many relatively small countries, and they communicate with each other, but they are, in a way, even though permeable between each other, they have a very different languages. And so the history of anime consumption, anime distribution, and then anime consumption in these countries is different, because it is, in a way, divided by the language divide. So each country has its own history, also in terms of the stages and time frames of how and with which frequency or amount anime series and movies have arrived and have been released there. So I will mainly focus on Italy, because it is my country, but the coincidence is that Italy is the country that by far has been the most receptive country in Europe, and in general in the West, if the numbers do not betray me, in terms of amount of anime series released as broadcast nationwide, and home video releases and films releases in theaters, as well as numbers of manga published, at least until 2005 or so. The experience of Italy and France are pretty similar, even though they have been chasing each other during these decades. Italy and France are considered cousin countries in Europe. We say this to each other because we share many similar experiences in history and culture. And a similar case with France and Italy is Spain. So these three countries, when I will speak about Italy during this talk, I will implicitly often refer to France and Spain as well, which share with Italy very similar experiences. Okay, these are the three big countries in Europe that share this big experience with Japanese animation, qualitatively and quantitatively, historically. Okay, so I want to share with you a few also premises, of course, I'm saying already that each given country has its own history. I also would like to emphasize with you that the way I see the study of animation in Japanese animation in its foreign context, there is a lot of justified emphasis on fandoms. So in fandom studies, we understand how anime had a strong hold on fan communities around the world. However, I'd like to point out that Japanese animation, both in Japan and then in many foreign countries, has had a strong hold with the mainstream audiences, with children and families and society at large. Not everywhere, but we shouldn't forget the mainstream aspects of anime abroad. And by mainstream, I talk about the three layers of mainstreamness, so to speak. The first is the general distribution. So the fact that how many anime arrive, etc. Then there is the level of consumption styles. So whether an anime is broadcast on a private television or on a national television, nationwide, or through thematic channels. So there are degrees of mainstreamness in that. And then there is also the layer of social penetration. So through different layers, then we have a final effect, which is how deep the culture that informs anime as a product has reached deeper layers, deeper levels of the socio-cultural fabric of a country, the public debate, and other cultural dimensions, so to be domesticated, so to be adopted as if it were part of the national culture and not just an alien object coming from somewhere abroad. Okay, so this is it summarizes what I've just said. Sorry if there is not a big matching or a coordination between what I say and the slides, but I would be happy to give Jimin the slides if any students would like to have them. No problem from me. There are two interrelated phenomena that are to be seen diachronically in a linear chronological fashion. First, what usually we call anime boom is usually referred to what happened in Japan between the late 1970s and the early 1980s, with an explosion of successful anime movies and anime series, especially of science fiction, but not only, between, say, 1977 and 1982-84. But an anime boom also happened with different characteristics as a recipient context in a few European countries. You remember Italy, France, Spain. The first anime boom happened pretty much in the same years, because when the anime boom happened in Japan, a huge import of anime series and films happened also in these three countries in the same years. And then another boom, specifically more about manga, so comics made in Japan, in the 1990s and across the 2000s. So no country is special or particularly unique, but each country has something to tell us about that particular synergy that can be created between the local context and this so particular, but at the same time so universal form of entertainment that anime can be, particular because of certain cultural nation-specific characteristics, but also universal because of the bond that it make happen between what happens to the characters and their development and the personal experience of young viewers, be them little kids or teenagers or young adults or older adults, depending on what we are watching. So what Italy can, well, maybe teach is a big word. What Italy can share with us is what happens with social penetration of this particular culture, Japanese popular culture, through animation, when it is distributed and consumed through deeply and largely mainstream forms of distribution and consumption, not through subculture and niche-like fandom-like situations, so not like bottom-up, but top-down. That is an interesting peculiarity because in Italy, as well as in France, anime arrived from the main door, entered the country from the main door through nationwide broadcasts made through the national Italian television. Again, that's not unique. There are big networks, whether private or national, in other countries that did the same with Japanese animations, especially in the late 70s, early 80s. Another astonishing case in Asia is, in fact, the Philippines that I mentioned before. But there are some characteristics in such small countries like Italy. Well, small, 60 million people. It's relatively small by Asian standards, right? And it gives me the chance to also introduce a few sociological concepts. Okay, so nostalgia is not a sociological concept, but it can be treated, as we will see later, sociologically, as well as the concept of sociocultural penetration through the category of national popular. We will see later. I will give you some space, few seconds to read here. So here, what we have is not just the embracing of anime's characters and narrative universes. It's the adoption of certain characters or a variety of characters and stories as Italian, even though, and this is one of the maybe not unique but rare aspects of the way certain European countries, Italy and France in particular, have experienced Japanese animation. The fact that since day one, since the first ignition of anime in these countries, there was a big hype about the fact that they were coming from Japan. So the Japanese origin was not hidden or undertoned as it happened in other contexts, even in Asia. the classic example is the United States, where anime were not known as Japanese for decades because of the heavy adaptations. I'm not judging whether that was right or wrong. Each country has its own policies with foreign products. Okay, so in the case of Italy, I can tell you that there was not, a noble intention of dignifying Japanese anime as coming from Japan. It was probably the proverbial, if you will, Italian laziness, or it was more seriously talking the fact that there was no perceived need to change the origin, the names of most characters, and names of the locations. And in the mainstream media outlets, as you can see here, there was a strong accent on promoting the fact that these animations, these animated cartoons, were not American or European. They were something new. They were something alternative. Okay, alternative visually and alternative as origin. But you can see that through this media coverage on big newspapers in Italy, I will show you also something in France, and big press magazines for families or housewives. There was the constant reproduction of certain stereotypes about Japan as a country, as an industrial context. So, for example, there was a probably understandable comparison with Disney. So the new Disneys here come from Japan. There was the idea that the stereotype or the prejudice of Japanese industry copying European or American ideas. That was never really true. There was probably a mutual inspiration. Europeans are also very good at copying, by the way. But there was this reproduction of stereotypes, and yet it was some kind of passive-aggressive compliment to the Japanese. You don't copy anyone. Now you are creative. Now you are invent. Japanese have always been very creative, as we know, but bear with me. What I'm trying to say here is that there was a big, strong emphasis on the Japanese-ness of this animated series on television, and with interviews to the creators. So completely different approach compared to other national contexts of reception in the same years. I will not get into details, but I will show you that the language of anime became, in a way, proverbial. It went deep also in the vernacular language of Italy. So the names of Japanese characters were used to create war jokes, for example, about famous athletes like football players. By football, I mean football, that is soccer. And this is a famous cover on the left of a Paris Match, famous weekly magazine in France, that says La folie Goldorak, the grandizer folly, fad, or madness. I'm focusing on this character because it is one of those that put France and Italy in common. They have in common the popularity of this particular series, which you don't have to think that this is particularly beautiful compared to others, but it was one of the first and one of the most beloved, but not the only one. But it was not the only. As you can see here, we have also phenomena of co-production that was received anyway and understood anyway as mainly coming from Japan. For example, Barba Papa is very famous in the United States, in Europe. It's a European creation, but the studio that made the animation was in Japan. And the same with this Maya the Bee, which comes from illustrated novels by a German author and was a co-production between a German company and Japanese animation studio, plus, of course, other entirely originally Japanese series, and the big element of production of toys from Japan to Europe, or licensing processes in which Italian or European companies producing toys got the license to create those toys based on Japanese franchises. So the business was at 360 degrees in especially those two countries, France and Italy, and also others like Spain, and others would come later, for example, Germany. So when I was talking about time frame, there is also this aspect. For example, in Germany, there is some kind of 10 years delay compared to Spain, Italy, and France, and the popularity that anime had in Italy, France, and Spain in the 1980s was reached in Germany 10 years later, in the 1990s, and in Poland, for example, in the 2000s, and so on. So these are the three main dimensions that you can think of when we want to find constructs on Japan, partly based on the long-term popularity gained by anime and then manga over 30 or 40 years of stay in these countries. In Italian or French textbooks, for example, for the school, for high school, you can see that when in geography, when you study the various countries and then you go to the Asian continent and then you talk about Japan, you talk about geography and the Shinkansen and the Second World War. And then today, they're also mentioned to anime and manga with some images also. And then there's a political cultural debate. Another very important dimension of the penetration of the culture informing manga and anime is when politicians mention anime characters publicly when they make a public, not a public speech, but when they are interviewed as metaphors, as jokes. It is, if you will, a banalization of those characters, but it means that if a politician mentions that, we are at a particular level of penetration. It's not just a niche, and niches are important, of course, fandoms are important, but it's a different kind of game there, okay? So the story is not that short, it's quite long. So it is a long wave that started in the 1950s. So in the first, in the early 1950s, there was a huge popularity in Europe, especially in Italy and France, for the star of Akira Kurosawa, famous Japanese film director. He won in Venice, maybe in Cannes too. Now I don't recall exactly, but several movies were first projected in those festivals and gained also wide public success. And that created a new attention for Japanese cinema. It was really the golden age for Japanese cinema in Europe. And that also attracted in certain countries the idea to buy TV series based on samurai stories and things like that. And that also connected those agents from Europe to the fact that companies like Toho or Toei were not just producing live action series, they were also doing a lot of animation. And in those years, in several European countries, a new audience was basically noticed, kids. And therefore, a lot of series were purchased by European agents. Japanese companies were pointing much more to the United States and to Asian context. They were thinking that Europeans would never be so interested in Japanese cartoons, but they were proven wrong. And the main initiative in the 1970s and 80s was by European distribution agencies, which try to buy as many series as possible at very low prices. And the Japanese companies sold those series at very low prices, usually 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/5 of the cost per episode of an average American or European animated series. So there was, in a way, what was called an invasion of anime or Japanese animated cartoons, because the word anime was not yet known in Europe, on European televisions in these three countries that I mentioned before. But actually, it was not, the Japanese who invaded the European TV stations. It was quite the opposite. It was European agents who tried to seize this opportunity of having very intriguing and new, visually and narratively new series, to purchase them at a low price and to make a very, very good business with a lot of increasingly numerous TV stations in Europe that were craving for having new products at low cost that could fill the programming rosters. So in particular, in Italy, there was a European record of about 400 private stations in the 1980s. So 400 private television stations in the 1980s in a country that is, as I said, relatively small. So Japan as a particular cultural context was often emphasized. So we knew when we were watching anime in the 1980s that the aliens were systematically attacking Japan, Tokyo. We didn't know for what reason, but because it was the strongest nation with all those robots or spaceships. But that's also what happens when in Hollywood movies, aliens always land in the United States. So that was a really alternative in those times. Okay, they're not going to the US, they're going to attack Japan. Okay. So as I was saying, there was a spreading of spontaneous marketing, not only official marketing, but even illegal merchandise that created an even bigger hype for everything that was anime characters, not only for boys, clearly, but also for little kids and for girls. And actually, whereas in Japan, a series like this one, say Candy Candy, is typically considered a shoujo manga and a shoujo anime, so for little girls. Spectators in Europe didn't care at all, and also a lot of boys, grandpas and grandmas and moms would watch weekly, or maybe more than weekly, 3 days a week, the new episodes, because that was kind of a soap opera or a feuilleton, to use a European word, a word in French, a feuilleton, like social romantic novel with interesting values. So there was an overlap of heroes on 3 layers, completely Japanese heroes. Japanese heroes that were actually inspired by European or American literature, such as Candy Candy, which is Japanese, written by Japanese authors, but it's set between the United States and England. And then Japanese animations that were completely drawn upon European or American novels, say Sans Famille, Boy Without a Family, or Anne of the Green Gables, and so on. Okay, so I have maybe 10-15 more minutes in which I want to share with you a theoretical framework to analyze the brokering of anime to Europe, and some concepts, depending on who I'm talking to, whether students or colleagues, you may know or not know these concepts. But again, bear with me, I want to share them with you because I use them, I think, fruitfully, also to publish an interesting article on the dynamics of arrival of the first anime in Europe. And I use the categories of cultural intermediation, according in particular to Georg Simmel, and then developed by Pierre Bourdieu. And it's interesting that what happened with cultural intermediation in the context of anime from Japan to Europe, the notion of cultural broker and knowledge brokers was very interesting. So they had to transfer knowledge, but at the same time, they had to create meaning. So they were not simply cultural gatekeepers, they were authentic cultural intermediators, but because they had to communicate to people who were a bit deaf, they had to make them understand the value of the new product. And the interlocutors in Europe at times, they didn't even understand that they were in before an interesting product with cultural interest and commercial potential. So what happened in what I describe more in detail in the article that I will of which I will give you the reference later, I used also the notions of tertius gaudens, tertius jungens, and tertius transferens, which are sociological slash economic concepts. Well, they are also used in studies of marketing to explain the various facets of the cultural intermediator and the knowledge broker. So the notion of thirdness in a way, but it's a notion of somebody who puts in touch with different accents. So these distributors, these agents in Europe needed to make people in television understand that they could make money with this Japanese series. So they had to create not just a cultural meaning or cultural value for these Japanese cartoons, they also had to show why and how they could become successful. So there was not a romantic vision of these products are so beautiful, kids will like them. It was more pragmatic and more money oriented. So I want to a bit disenchant this idea that anime arrived in Europe just because the Japanese pushed them or because fans wanted them. In Italy and France, this happened really top down, as I said before. And then the dynamic also began to be bottom up. So there was kind of a reversal of what happened in other countries, where first the niche and the subculture are born, and then there is a more mainstream or generalized interest or acceptance of these foreign products. So these are more technical, theoretical quotes that I think I don't have so much time to elaborate upon, but they are in a way a summary of what is written in one of the articles that I've been writing these years. So I think I can leave that in this way, and is for the slides that I will give to Jimin. But let me at least explain that in that first situation in the late 70s, we're talking about 1976, 1977, 1978, when the interest for anime was ignited in Europe. There was actually, as I said, animations in Japan had no meaning. They were just considered incomprehensible and not usable for European television. So an operation of meaning mining, if you will, had to be created. So they had not just to, they had to really dig, these distributors had to dig themselves, because they had to find what kind of meaning this anime could have for the European audiences. Finally, this meaning was found when you look at anime, when you understand the Japanese cartoons, you understand that they also have stories, and in 40 episodes, a character develops. It's not just each episode standalone episode like Tom and Jerry. It's a novel in episodes, so they could find things like that, different ways of understanding what animation for kids could be. And it was in the end a huge success, because in Italy or France, hundreds of anime series were broadcast on national television, and dozens of movies, Japanese animated movies, were released in theaters, especially in the 1980s. But even today, clearly, you know that, I mean, Ghibli Star Studio movies are not, they are kind of a standard internationally, but this is another story for another another conference, maybe. However, the story of anime in Europe is not always like triumphant. There are also elements that makes us understand that what is successful today can fade away depending on the conditions, depending whether the conditions change. So in the 1990s, 2000, there was there was much less Japanese animation on television in Europe, especially in France or Italy and Spain, while in other countries there was a growth according to that kind of gap in the time frame that I talked about. But since nature doesn't like emptiness, or in this case, culture doesn't like it, what was lacking in terms of amount of anime broadcast on television was counterbalanced by a new boom that I was talking about before, the boom of manga. Former kids who were kids in the 1970s and 80s, in the 1990s and became young adults, and some of them became operators of the publishing industry, and they decided to knock the door of the Japanese publishing houses, and they became publishers, because they said, if we can't have anime, because televisions can't broadcast them anymore for a variety of reasons, among which polemics and scare among parents, let's publish manga. Why? Because, as you know, in many cases, manga are the original stories that then they are turned into anime. At least that was the norm in the 1970s and 80s. So those former kids republished in manga form many of the same stories that they had enjoyed as anime 10 or 15 years earlier. And then they introduced to the Japanese imagination two new generations of kids who had not really experienced so many anime, but they started from manga. So there was, in a way, a reversal up to a certain point, and then a new convergence of these two media forms, anime and manga, in a unique blend, especially for the new generations today. There's no rupture between manga and anime, even more than what happened before, and so the success has reprised. However, there are also fears or elements that can create shortcomings. The factors that created issues in Europe, even today, in distributing anime at the mainstream level, are very quickly summarized in this slide. Along the years, the prices of anime for international trade have increased, because, of course, the Japanese studios and companies understand that if their franchises are so in demand, there is the chance to get on pair with the prices of other international productions, European and American cartoons. But there's also another, and so many companies in Europe decided not to buy such expensive series. Why? Because the prejudice is still there. European televisions, if they have to spend a certain amount of money, if they have to choose between an American or European series and the Japanese series, if the amount of money is the same, they will always go towards the American or European series. It's not racism, it's just a form of prejudice that is also brought and facilitated by the fact that since the 1990s, and especially today, the targets of the majority of anime are not anymore kids, but older teens and especially young adults, and a specific category called otaku that you know very much about, right? So this segmentation and this creation of subgroups and very specific targets is very negative for the policy of animation broadcasting in Europe. I have collected a variety of interviews with people who are program directors for many TV stations in various European countries: Italy, France, Spain, Poland, Switzerland, Sweden, and so on. I've been touring to understand what the issues may be, and they all told me similar things. And also the distinction or the transition from broadcasting to narrowcasting, which is an old concept also from the 1990s, but the return from mainstream to subcultural, and so the creation of many different fan communities that have specific interests, and they in a way feed a certain culture of anime, but it's a bit more, if you will, hidden, and for the major players it's a bit not that important as major audiences are, like families and kids. And so and also as you know very well, the arrival of the international global libraries of products that create a different form modality of consumption of anime, which is a bit less choral than it was 10 or 20 years ago, but nonetheless still significant. And in fact, players like Netflix are, as you know, investing a lot in producing or co-producing anime of very interesting and sometimes very high quality. I think there's no time to talk about the notion of transacculturation, which is also a notion that I have tried to introduce in the book, The Dragon and the Dazzle. But the slides are there for you to enjoy, hopefully, through Jimin. And I think I can stop here for now. And maybe if, depending on the questions that you may ask, I can browse through the slides. Maybe there can be the coincidence in which what you ask is in one of the slides that I'm not showing. So for now, thank you so much for your endurance in listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed it a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, okay, there is some question. Okay, I'm collecting. And the first question is actually from the beginning, you mentioned, you say Europe, but this is about Spain and France, Italy. And the question is like, among so many 27, European countries, is there any specific reason that, the Japanese manga anime is really popular, particularly in Spain, France, and Italy compared to other, European countries?
So yeah, fundamentally, anime, so Japanese cartoons per se, we don't have the counter proof because we can only see how history happened, right? So, but I think I can say that it was a very progressive, gradual, step-by-step process. Japanese animated cartoons per se were relatively ignored, and as well as Japanese comics, they were pretty much ignored in Europe, even though there was an attention for Japanese culture, in particularly in the UK, in France, and in Italy, since the late 19th century. So the very word manga was introduced in the intellectual circles in Europe in the second part of the 19th century, thanks to that very famous exhibition of Hokusai manga at the Paris Universal Exposition of 1867. And then there was the fad for Japonism, that particular trend in arts and at a certain level even fashion in various in the European countries that I mentioned. So there was so Japan was present in the cultural horizon of the upper classes in Europe. Then what happened was that besides the literature that was started to be translated, especially in France and the UK in the after the war, there was this I would say the director of the Destiny, Akira Kurosawa. He really created the interest for cinema made in Japan. It was already present in the radar of festivals, but never with very strong interest or success from my recollections. From Akira Kurosawa's movies on in the 1950s, it was possible for the big studios to import or to show through the festivals the first movies. So the first movie that was, the first animated movies that was shown at a festival was in Venice in 1959, and it was, as I showed in one slide, Hakujaden, the Legend of the White Snake, which was the first color feature-length movie made by Toei Doga, so Toei Animation. And after that, and he won a special prize. So instantaneously, it was said that Toei was the Disney Studios of the Orient. Sorry for the word, but that was used at the time. And there was no derogatory accent in that way. It was really honest curiosity in the perspective of a multicultural approach to cinema and to animation. It was the same years in which also Chinese animations were seen as very interesting elements of cultural difference in Europe. So that was the first step. Then other films, other animated films for kids would be released in French and European cinemas. And that created also an interest for a different media format, not just the movie film, the theatrical movie, but also the TV series. And as I said, through the samurai style live action or science fiction tokusatsu, so special effects science fiction series that were acquired by some French and Italian distributors, they understood, these distributors understood that there was a huge production that could be exploited in a way that could be, bought from Japan. And so this mechanism was mainly quantitative. And it was basically, the good thing was that the Japanese productions were of very high quality. Like animations in Japan were very exciting to look at, and they had very profound stories. They were very exciting, and they were very child-friendly in a way, like a science fiction tokusatsu. They were beautiful to look at, and they were actually highly inspired from the British series by Jerry and Linda Anderson, like Thunderbirds, which were famous in Japan since the late 1960s. And so many of these TV series, both anime and live action, were inspired by also American and European experiences with science fiction and special effects and so on. So there was a circularity. So the interesting paradox, to end my long answer, was that in the 1970s, little audiences of kids and adults could see that kind of synergy, that interesting milkshake of Japanese elements and the reminiscence of elements that could be recognized as familiar from previous American science fiction movies. So there was a mix of things that created this particular connection visually in terms of spectacle, plus something that you could never see in American or European cartoons, the depth of the characters, the depth of the stories, and the development of the narrative with big themes: death, sacrifice, honor, war, little kids who became masters of their own destiny, things that could never happen in European cartoons. And that was something that really created a long-term bond even today. So when kids today watch anime from the 1970s, they are completely glued to the screen.
Okay, thank you. Actually, the next question is related to what you already answered some part. The question is like, why this, Japanese anime and manga was so popular in Spain, in Europe, this kind of things. And then part you already mentioned about the, story and depth. But another one here, the student mentioned is, basically you're showing the PowerPoint there. Basically, you can see that there's a big eyes and blonde hair. So basically, the question is like usually when you watch, Japanese anime and manga, we can see that there's a lot of blonde hair and then, blue eyes and big eyes, even though the production is Japanese, So basically this tends to raise question, along with the story and depths of whatever, but the appearance, the figure, whatever, is it, one of the success factor that Japanese animation became really popular in Europe?
Okay, this is a very important question. It's not my answer. It will not be sociological. It will be more about the history of aesthetics and why certain characteristics are so embedded in Japanese animation. But I need to be quick, right? So certain aspects of the aesthetics that have been and are considered in a way the norm or standard in Japanese cartoons, such as a variety of colors in the hair of some characters or the size and shape of the eyes, come from phenomena in the development of popular culture in Japan that predate anime and manga or are parallel to anime and manga. And they are related, for example, to the development of the toy industry, in particular dolls, since the 1920s in Japan, which were made by a few designers who were very fond of some European standards of beauty and European styles of making dolls, the French dolls in porcelain of the 1920s or late 19th century, etc. And this also relates to the variety of hairstyles of those dolls made in Japan in those years and illustrations that were European doll inspired. At the same time, after the Second World War, manga for children, both boys and girls, was established. So the visual standards were established by certain very influential authors, both men and women, not just the very famous Osamu Tezuka, but also other female authors, and they were also inspired by some European models of the 1950s and 60s. And while Tezuka was inspired by the Disney and Fleischer cartoons of the 1930s and 1940s. And so the coding of the eyes for anime manga characters became that kind of big eyes. But the morphology and the physiognomy of characters in manga and anime is usually referred to the body type of the Japanese person and to the face type of the Japanese person in a cartoonish way. So you don't have to connect the fact that you see big eyes to the fact that those characters may not be Japanese. They often are Japanese. And even if they are not Japanese, say in a series like Candy Candy, they are coded visually as if they were Japanese, but with blonde eyes, some freckles, and blonde hair, freckles, and blue eyes, etc. So there is a mixing of features, but the general visual texture is communicating that that character has to look more like a Japanese girl than a European girl. This also, if you notice the proportions of real Japanese girls or boys and the way they are then referred to in anime and manga, you will see that there is a very stylized innuendo to the visual features of real Japanese person. This has been proved also in many studies by various scholars. For example, the size of the nose for anime and manga characters, the nose is small because it has to represent the fact that Japanese person has a nose that is smaller than the nose of a European person. And this dates back to the ways Europeans were usually drawn in satirical magazines since the late 19th century, like Tokyo Puck, the Japan Punch, etc. You would see that we Europeans were drawn a bit, not like monsters, but in a caricatural way, with very long nose, very long chin, very long earlobes, and so on. So, so when a European, that has to be narratively European in a manga or anime, he or she is drawn using different markers to communicate that that person is European. So you will see that the nose is bigger, that there is a shade produced by the nose that is bigger than what happens with the smaller nose of a Japanese character. And the eyes have longer eyelashes. So it's not the size of the eye at all, it's other features. So this is also to completely, debunk the bias that many foreign viewers or readers have about the visual features of the faces of characters in manga and anime. They are much more complex than just, okay, this is Japanese, why is the character Caucasian? No, it's not Caucasian at all. It's your bias that makes you believe that that character looks Caucasian. It's not. There's a beautiful article by Terry Kawashima from 2002, I think. Now I don't remember the title, but it's about this very topic. So if you check it, you can find it. Terry Kawashima. An American scholar of Japanese origin.
Okay, Terry Kawashima. Okay, there is another question. It's rather simple. The question is, what is the most famous Japanese anime among young people in Europe?
What is the most famous anime
Japanese
character?
Anime.
The most famous
I guess
anime
it's the
character
title.
in Europe. Yeah, it varies from country to country, and it varies also from generation to generation. Let's say If I have to say among the 40 something in Italy or France, I would say Uforobo Grendizer, but also Rupan Sansei, or also Lady Oscar, so Versailles Nobara, as well as Mazinger Z in Spain in particular, but also in Italy, and Captain Harlock, Uchukai Zoku Captain Harlock in France and Italy, and Dragon Ball pretty much everywhere, but very much characteristic of Spain. So the role that franchise had in Spain, it was adapted, for example, in all the country's language, which are Catalan, Castilian, the Basque language, and Sailor Moon very much in Poland and in Russia. For example, there is a famous Russian ice skater, Evgenia Medvedeva, who in 2016 and then 2017 performed worldwide with a piece in which she was the protagonist of Sailor Moon, and then she turned into Sailor Moon, and that was had a big hype also in Japan, of course. And then many sports anime are very famous everywhere. You're in particular Captain Tsubasa, because it's about football. So in Italy, in France, in Spain, hugely famous. It also inspired many champions of the past generation to become football players, or anyway, they encouraged them, like Del Piero, Totti, and others. Just to mention the Italian ones, but and also volleyball anime, very famous in Italy or France or Germany. In fact, I want to show you a video, if I may. Sorry, again, I want to go to the right slide first. So to show you the popularity of volleyball and the penetration of anime at the mainstream level as a style of communication. This is the TV commercial that promotes the participation of the Italian female volleyball team to the back then imminent World Volleyball Championship for women that would be held in Tokyo in September 2018. So this TV commercial that I'm showing you was broadcast by national television in Italy to promote the broadcasting of the games, especially the games by the Italian national team. So the song is the opening theme of the famous anime series Attack You, a series from the early 1980s that is hugely famous in Italy or France, among others. And volleyball champions in Italy or other European countries declared in official interviews that when they were kids, they loved this kind of anime and they wanted to become champions or players inspired by these cartoons. So that's why I said it's a long-term process.
Okay, thank you. I think this will be the last question. The question is like for a certain period, Japan produced a lot of anime manga related to robots. Like you already mentioned Grandizer, Mazinger, but it was really concentrated during the very short time, and then the students want to know exactly what happened and why they produced such a animation during that time.
Okay, I see. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly, it is true that there was a strong concentration in the 1970s, from basically 1972 with Astro Ganga and Mazinga Z to, let's say, 1982, 1984. Then other anime with robots and giant armors continued to be produced, but with less and less success, because there was, of course, a diversification of genres, the growth of that audience, and the segmentation of the audience, and what can I say, the predominance of the third generation of otaku. The Japanese philosopher Hiroki Azuma, in his 2001 book about postmodernity through the filter, through the lens of otaku culture, identifies, is not the only one, 3 generations of otaku. Well, in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, and 1990s. Well, when there was the transition from the second to the third generation of otaku, the third generation of otaku basically embraced only one big or couple of big franchises of robots, which were not anymore robots, but armors, mobile suits, to be more precise, like Gundam and Macross and similar franchises that were a bit more minority, right? So then there was the kind of the adulthood of fans in an audience in Japan, and the diversification of genres and the adulthood of fans produced less interest for robot anime. I have also to say, this is a very personal opinion, I think that the topics of giant robot anime finished their parable, their life cycle in the 1980s with the generation of creators that were born before or during the Second World War. They had experienced a very different approach to what the world is and what role Japan would play in it. So they experienced extreme poverty. They were probably related to people who died in the atomic bomb droppings. So the grand narrative that they developed in those robot series was very profound, very typical of their own experience or what they wanted to transmit to the new generation. That thing naturally faded away with the new generations of anime producers and anime directors, and there were new stories to tell to the nation. And it's a normal process of innovation and different new trends, different topics that you need to tell to the new audience. You cannot always stay. And if you take away the drama and the depth of those series from robot stories, you have, I don't know, Transformers, beautiful robots, but they don't have the same narrative depth. With all due respect to Transformers as a franchise, they are an honest franchise. So I think this is the main reason that also emerged from the interview I had with several directors that were directors of this series.
Okay, Professor Pelletieri, thank you very much for your great presentation. It was very interesting. Also, the Q&A questions.
Thank you for your questions.
Just that was interesting. Anyway, thank you so much for your insight as well, and then your time. And we really appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much. And then thank you for your question as well. All right. Okay. Have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.